Utah Jazz head coach Quinn Snyder announcing that he will step down tomorrow. And as we continue to talk about Phoenix Suns continuity, what can the Suns learn about the unwinding of Utah's little mini era here that will inform if they can stay at the top of the Western Conference going forward? Talk about it on today's Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendan Clean, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons and a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen today and every day. Welcome. Happy Monday. And I am appreciative of each and every one of you who continue to tune in. Hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Hit follow. And if you were finding us on YouTube, the best way to listen to Locked On Suns, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right below here as well. And leave me a comment. Do you think this Utah Jazz situation has anything to do with the Suns? Is there anything to be learned? And if so, what do you think those lessons are? I'll dive into mine in just a second. First, today's show, guys, brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered all year long with more props, odds, and lines than anyone else. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, Quinn Snyder stepping down. I think it's like 8 seasons as the head coach of the Utah Jazz. Really the end of an era. I mean, it's 8 seasons. There was the Gordon Hayward era. There was the Donovan Mitchell era. Snyder was there the whole time. And so it's a big change in the Western Conference. It's a big change that might not seem like it affects the Suns, might not seem like it affects the Warriors, who are about to compete, who are competing for a title, just one game too. But it does matter. I talked last week. I've been talking about continuity a lot, and that's really the biggest reason that I want to talk about Quinn Snyder, the Jazz, the Western Conference in general. That'll be the whole kind of focus of the show today. Continuity and the hierarchy within the West, because I continue to believe that the lesson, more so than anything else, about the outcome of the NBA playoffs this season is that in the era of player movement, in the era of versatility and just incredible talent up and down the NBA, continuity, chemistry, culture, those things are continuing to matter. They've always mattered, maybe even mattering more because it's harder to come by. So with Quinn Snyder stepping down, we now have what I want to call the continuity 5. All right. So the Jazz used to be in there, used to be the continuity 6. The Suns are in there. And what that group is the teams in the league that have had a head coach, a basketball operations lead, so general manager or higher title than that, and then a franchise player, a franchise cornerstone player, all of those 3 together for at least 3 seasons. So the Celtics and Nuggets were in that group until recently. The Celtics with Brad Stevens being elevated to general manager, and then the Nuggets with Tim Connolly leaving. Those group 2 would have been in there. The Jazz would have been in there before Snyder left. So who are they now? The continuity 5. Well, the Suns. Point of me bringing this up on a Suns show here. Obviously, James Jones, Monty Williams, Devin Booker just completed season number 3 together. Monty actually is the lowest amount of time here. James and Book have been together for 5 years, 4 as a general manager. The other 4 teams in the continuity 5, aside from the Suns, the Grizzlies, which is actually pretty surprising. They all are exactly 3 seasons, but they are 3 seasons. The Bucks, not a surprise. And then 2 conference finalists in the Heat and the Warriors. So those teams probably don't come as a surprise. Actually, Jimmy Butler is only just now finishing his 3rd season, so he's just on the cusp as well. Really, it's the Bucks and the Warriors who have blown that 3-season thing out of the water. The others are just hanging on by a thread. It's pretty incredible. I guess maybe the Spurs are in there, actually, because the general manager and the head coach have both been there for so long. But I don't know who you would call their franchise player, so that's a little different. DeJounte Murray, I don't know. I don't remember when he got drafted, 2018, 2019. I guess they're actually in there, too. Donovan Mitchell, already in the aftermath of the Jazz leaving this continuity group and Quinn Snyder stepping down, is already throwing his weight around. So you saw Adrian Wojnarowski tweeting something that basically says Donovan Mitchell wants to have input. He probably understands that, staying in Utah might still be best for him in the short term, but he wants to have more control, is what it seems like. And so he wants to have a little bit of more than a little bit. He wants to have a pretty big hand in deciding who the next coach is going to be. I'm not going to get into the Utah stuff, but that leads me to what my point again is with the Suns. Not only are they in that very, very upper echelon of continuity in the NBA, but they are also so lucky to have never dealt with Devin Booker playing this card. Booker never leaked this type of thing to the media. He never, look, Donovan's lucky to even have had a coach for that many seasons in his career in a row. Book had a new one every season and still never did this. And I'm not even pointing this at Mitchell. It's just to show how precarious this whole thing is. You talk about Atlanta. Trae Young had a role in a coach getting fired early in his career. You talk about Zion Williamson, who recently, this was his third coach in 3 seasons. He didn't even get coached by Willie Green really much this year. You'd expect Willie will be back next season. But both Alvin Gentry and Stan Van Gundy had a hard time getting through to Zion Williamson. This happens all around the NBA. The Suns got Booker's trust despite never really earning it. And they still never had to go through all of this. This is another reason, by the way, the Suns absolutely have to give Devin Booker the Supermax this summer. When you just look at how rare it is in the league to have the trust of a good relationship with your franchise player and have that franchise player continue to get better and better and better throughout the entirety of his early prime we're not even to Devin Booker's prime yet. The other lesson from this whole Utah thing, aside from that continuity stuff, the franchise player stability stuff, is that you cannot get complacent. So I'm not going to pretend to be a Jazz expert, but a very kind of initial look at this whole thing to me is that the biggest mistake Utah made was keeping the roster basically the same throughout the entire Mitchell era, which is 5 full seasons now, even though it feels shorter than that. 5 seasons. They lost in the playoffs year after year, never made the conference finals, and still kind of rolled along with a roster that wasn't working. So, early on, after Hayward leaves and they draft Mitchell, they have Ricky Rubio and Derek Favors in there, despite a pretty old-fashioned fit, right? Those guys, that's 2 non-shooters in addition to Rudy Gober. That's a really tough thing to pull off. And they're just, look, they're not elite players. Like you would want better talent than that. So then in 2019, they get Bogdanovich, they get Clarkson, and they get Conley, all in that 1 year. And then basically from that point on, the roster's been the same. Now they move on from Favors, then they bring Favors back. They do all this stuff, but at the end of the day, the starting group and the main backups are the same guys for 3 full seasons, and that's including a disappointing loss in the bubble to the Nuggets in that Murray-Mitchell duel in the bubble, if you guys remember. And then in 2021, the epic comeback collapse where Paul George, without Kawhi Leonard, beats the Jazz 2 times and wins that series to move on to the conference finals and play the Suns. So I think James Jones has to keep that in mind too. He's done a great job to build a good team around Booker, build a team that makes Booker better and more comfortable, has seemingly a pretty good relationship with Book, and has this continuity intact that if you even expand beyond the franchise player, the Warriors have, in addition to obviously Steph being that cornerstone franchise guy, they have Draymond, they have Clay, they even have Kevon Looney and Andre Iguodala, these other role players who have been there for a long time. The Heat have the same thing. The Bucks have the same thing. The Grizzlies actually have the same thing. So the Suns also have that, and that's important, but you also need to win. And if you lose in heartbreaking fashion, if you lose in such a fashion that shows you the roster has flaws, you have to be willing to change it up. It's pretty crazy in hindsight that the Jazz lost in the second round last year the way that they did and basically did nothing. They re-signed, and forgot Joe Ingles. He's been there forever too. He got traded this season because he got hurt. They re-signed Conley, and that was basically all that they did. That is crazy thing to do in hindsight. And it's no surprise that there continued to be some murmurs of problems behind the scenes. Now Snyder is leaving, and he's not that old of a guy. Utah is down a rung. And the lessons are pretty clear. They were already falling down the standings. They were the 1 seed last year. They were the 4 seed this year. They were due for some big change, but this puts them firmly in a second tier in my mind. So with that all said, what I want to do next is my very early 2022-2023 Western Conference Power Rankings. We'll do that after one quick break. First of all, guys, today's show brought to you by BetOnline, the number one source in your life, in my life, in all of our lives for sports odds, props, and info. They have podcasts and news and updated odds constantly on every single sport across the sports calendar. Basketball playoffs, NHL conference finals, you have the MLB regular season, and then, of course, constant fights in the MMA, UFC, boxing, all of it. Let's see what we can get here. I gave you guys the Cardinals regular season line last year, and that was just depressing. Regular season wins for the Lakers next season. The over-under is 46.5. Hit the under. You just got to keep your eye on it. Props, there's next season stuff already in every single sport, as well as finals and everything else. Live betting, esports, again, articles, news, podcasts, everything to inform the bets, place the bets, and get those earnings coming in. Head to the website today, guys, or use your mobile device to learn more about the latest trends and action. Bet online, where the game starts. As I said, my very early 2022-2023 Western Conference Power Rankings, now that the Jazz are seemingly down a peg. We have the Warriors now, too, cementing themselves, I think is fair to say. You make the finals, that's cementing. So here's what I'm going to do. 1 to 15, top to bottom, then I'll give you some broader takeaways from all of it. All right? Let me actually do the opposite. Let me start at 15. The Oklahoma City Thunder. 14, the Houston Rockets. 13, the Sacramento Kings. 12, the San Antonio Spurs. 11, the Portland Trailblazers. I think that they don't have much of a roster right now, so that one was a hard one this far out. The Lakers also don't have much of a roster. Pelicans, number 9. Utah Jazz, number 8, which based on talent is probably unfair, but I think we are in for some more change in Salt Lake City, so I can't necessarily feel great about putting them any higher than 8. Mostly because of who's above them and the amount of sheer competitiveness that there will be in the West next season. You know, even the Pelicans being at 9 there feels crazy. You know, that's where they were in this regular season. And so basically what that's saying is they won't even be able to get higher than that this year. I could see them getting as high as 7. Right now I have 7 as Minnesota. We'll see. I think they're another team on the upswing. It's hard to, feel bad about what's going on with the Timberwolves right now. They just got a new president. They have a great roster outside of, we'll talk about one part in a second. Number 6, I have the Denver Nuggets, and that's still mostly because of injuries. So that's been their sort of spot in the standings the past couple of years because they haven't had Jamal Murray, because they haven't had Michael Porter Jr. for some of that. And their roster has been puzzlingly poor, I would say, without wanting to pay a bunch of luxury tax money and all that stuff. So if Porter Jr., if Murray get back and healthy and great, I could see a pretty big uptick. But until then, we don't know. Similar, number 5, the Clippers. I think the Clippers have maybe the best roster in basketball when they're healthy, but that's been very hard to come by because both of their star players are injury risks. It's just a fact. Number 4 is where things get particularly interesting, and that's because I have the Phoenix Suns at number 4. And to be clear, these power rankings are not what I think the standings will be, but they're more so, the best path toward a championship as things stand right now. So number 3, I have the Mavericks. And that's sort of just the recency bias thing. That's sort of just the respect thing, but the Mavericks just beat the Suns in a playoff series. So it would feel pretty silly to me to turn right back around and put the Suns ahead of them. That would just be ignoring the outcomes. If we didn't need to pay attention to the results of the series, then we wouldn't have played any games and we just would have said the Suns won the series. Like that has to be taken into account, even if I still feel like the Suns have a better roster than Dallas overall, and I still would maybe pick them if they matched up in the playoffs again next season. I might take the Suns. But right now, I think you just have to have Dallas there. So I have them at number 3. Number 2, I have the Warriors, which is maybe a little bit of an upset in and of itself. You probably already know who I have number one because it's the only team I haven't said. But as much as I think the Warriors have been awesome, I do think that there's a little bit of they are an older team. They are a team that is counting on their young guys to continue to get a lot better as they move forward in their careers for this whole sort of project to pay off, right? Draymond isn't as great as he was in his prime. Clay has been very up and down, not as consistent as he was on either end of the floor. And Steph is 30 plus years old. So at some point, they need the younger guys to step up. So that's why I don't have them at one, even though they may win a freaking championship right now. The team I have at number one is Memphis. I feel like if Ja Morant stays healthy, they have a legitimate shot to beat Golden State in that series. I think if Ja Morant stays healthy, they probably would have been favored to beat Dallas in the conference finals. And, maybe they wouldn't have been favored against Boston, but they would have had home court. And making the finals is, what we're talking about the Warriors just having done. And that's the level of respect that you kind of have to treat the Grizzlies with, because I think there was a realistic path toward it. I think all four of these teams they were the final four teams in the West. And for good reason, they belong here. I just feel like the Grizzlies, with the ability that the fact that it's the fact that their best player is still in his early 20s. And he was already, a borderline, MVP vote getter, all NBA caliber player. He's going to continue to get better. He just doesn't make a ton of mistakes. He is growing his game as a scorer more and more. I think that team has an identity. They're deep. They're young. That's my number one. Major thoughts, major takeaways here. I'll start with the Suns. So I think, to me, the Suns have to be knocked down a peg after making the finals and then romping through the regular season. And then, reasonably, like, even if the game 7 in the second round was disappointing, I also feel like you have to be honest and just say, okay, they were one of the best four teams in the conference, even if they didn't, have a real shot at a championship like we expected. They are still the class of the conference, even if our expectations have changed. I just think you have to knock them down a little bit, because we all know that at some point the Chris Paul thing is going to have to slow down. And there's just a lot of roster questions. And there's an ownership question. So they're number 4 for me, as I said. Everybody, though, has big questions except for Memphis and Golden State, in my opinion. It's whether it's health, whether it's a trade, whether it's roster stuff, whether it's changes in the organization. Everybody has questions. So I think the West will be a lot better next year. I think the East was the better conference this season. I think next season it might balance out a little bit. I think you're going to have 10 or 11 pretty good playoff caliber teams going all the way down to Portland and maybe even San Antonio at 12. So it's going to be deep. It's going to be better, but everybody has big questions. The Mavs have to add a second star level shot creator if it's not going to be Jalen Brunson. Maybe it will be Jalen Brunson. I don't think that's what he's going to be in the NBA, is like a number 2 on a title team. So if that's the case, they need to find that guy. Clippers and Nuggets, they might be the 2 best teams in the conference next year if they're fully healthy and their guys can come back at 100%. But that's a lot to ask. We haven't seen that from either one of these teams for multiple seasons now. Minnesota has another new front office. We already know the D'Angelo Russell thing is an albatross for them. We just talked about the Jazz, new front office, new head coach, likely roster shakeup. And then the Lakers and Blazers, they have these over 30 Hall of Famers who they're having to retool around, and that's just a very bizarre situation. So again, this conference might have 12 playoff caliber teams in it, but aside from 2, I don't know what to expect from a lot of them, right? With that all said, I want to do questions. Okay, so I have my 5 biggest questions. I'll start with the Suns question, but my 5 biggest Western Conference questions heading into the offseason. We know the Utah thing is just the first domino. There will be more. You can bet on it. So what are the questions heading into the offseason that will kind of define this hierarchy, this ranking? We'll get into that in a second. First, so guys, today's show also brought to you by Locked On NBA Big Board. The draft is coming up, and you need to be informed. If you're an NBA fan, forget the Suns. We don't know if they're going to get a pick. Maybe not. Maybe they will. Who knows? But Locked On NBA Big Board's churning out stuff every day, making you smarter about the guys coming up in this draft. Who are the young players that are going to populate the league and be the next Ja Morant, be the next Zion Williamson. Rafael Barlow does an amazing job on that show, so check it out. All right, let's close things out. 5 biggest questions heading into the offseason for the Western Conference. I'll start with the Suns. What happens with DeAndre Ayton? This is no big surprise. I think it is one of the 5 most important things for the status of the West, because I already have the Suns at 4. If they take a little bit of a step back in an Ayton trade, let's say they did the Charlotte deal that we've kind of been bouncing around, and it's PJ Washington and it's Terry Rozier and Ayton goes back, some version centered on that. Okay, well, the team's probably getting worse because we don't know who the starting center is going to be. Their defense probably not going to be as good, and they're getting a little younger, right? That would make them probably fall back from 4. I would probably say that even the question mark Clippers and the question mark Nuggets would go above the Suns for me in that situation, right? Also, Ayton could end up on a different Western Conference team, depending on what the sign and trade market or the new contract market end up being for him. Portland, San Antonio, maybe even Dallas could all be players for DeAndre Ayton. And that would clearly shake things up in the West on 2 ends in that case. Both the Suns getting a little worse probably, and those teams maybe getting a little bit better and younger. My number 2 question is again on Utah. We know Quinn Snyder's gone. We know that Danny Ainge is in. We know that Dwayne Wade is in. New ownership is in. Do Rudy Gober and Donovan Mitchell stay with the Jazz? I don't think Donovan Mitchell is leaving. I think it seems today's news that Mitchell seems to want to have some input on the coach thing makes me feel better about him staying. And in turn, that makes me feel worse about Gobert staying. I think Gober was already the more likely player to leave. It feels like that this thing has run its course between the two of them. We all know the passing numbers were hilarious. Mitchell was not passing Gobert the ball. They don't talk to each other on the floor. It doesn't seem like much at all. They are constantly leaking stuff. That doesn't seem like it's possible. And Mitchell seems more likely to stay, especially after what he said today. So I think it'll be Gobert. But either way, that's a big question. Number 3. And this one relates to the Suns a little bit as well. Does Kevin Durant actually contemplate leaving Brooklyn? Because you would assume if things go that way, I'm not saying that they will. I'm not saying we have enough information to know any of that. But I continue to maintain not talking to your employer for a month is a red flag. If KD actually did contemplate that, you would bet that the Nets would be much more interested in trading him to the West than the East. So that affects the West quite a bit. It might not be the 3rd most important. These are not ranked. They're just 5. These are not top to bottom. I don't think Ayton is the single biggest question. The Gobert Mitchell thing might be bigger, and this one might be bigger. Number 4. How healthy is Kawhi Leonard? Because we can talk about Denver's injuries, but their best player has been healthy. We already know what that looks like. They're getting back their 2nd and 3rd best guys if they're healthy next year. They're not getting back their best player. The Clippers are getting back not only their best player, but to me, in both the 2019 playoffs and the 2021 playoffs, Kawhi Leonard was the best player in the league. He won a championship in 2019, and then in 2021, he was well on his way to doing that. I feel like the Clippers, if Kawhi is healthy, beat the Suns in the conference finals and probably beat the Bucks because they would have a Giannis. They would have multiple Giannis defenders, and they would have scorers and shooters. Their roster, guys, and it's even better than it was in 2021 because they went out and spent even more money to get guys like Robert Covington and who else? Is Eric Bledsoe there? No, he went to Portland. I know I'm forgetting somebody, but Covington just got signed an extension, and they're even longer and more versatile now. Kennard they got and signed to an extension. Like that roster is freakishly stacked. And if Kawhi Leonard is full Kawhi Leonard, even the guy he was in 2021 prior to the injury in the second round against Utah, he is maybe the best player in the NBA, and that team could finally romp their way to a title that we've been waiting for since they both joined up there in 2019. Last but not least, a little bit lower down my power rankings, but it actually could push this team up from number 9 where I had them, which is the New Orleans Pelicans. And the question is, what level will Zion Williamson return at? Because We saw how competitive they were against the Suns in the first round, pushing this to 6 games, having no business being in the games or winning the games that they did. Just from a talent standpoint, they're incredibly well coached now. They're pretty deep. They have a sort of smash mouth identity. Brandon Ingram is a legitimate all-star level player. And CJ McCollum seems to fit really well. I think that they need some sort of point guard. But if Zion comes back at, the form that he was in, again, similar to Kawhi prior to that injury, he was an all-star and an all-NBA caliber player. If he's that on top of what they already had, I think you're talking about a Pelicans team that can push for home court. Now, I understand you have to drop some other teams if that happens, but you figure maybe the Clippers and the Nuggets aren't quite as healthy. Maybe something does happen with the Suns. Maybe the Timberwolves or the Grizzlies, who I'm expecting to just keep jumping up, aren't quite as good. Maybe the Jazz take a step back. There's these options. And if Zion adds to that and he's at a great level, that team's going to be a nightmare. They're going to be really, really hard to defend, and they're going to be deep. They're going to come ready, and it's going to be really fun to watch. I mean, I'm pretty excited. But that's the 5, I think, to me. I don't know if you guys have more. Throw another comment down in the YouTube comments here if you are watching, and tell me what your biggest questions are about the West. I think there's another one that's sort of like, does Memphis get a star level second offensive weapon? But I couldn't come up with anybody who they could get, and I didn't want to get too far down that rabbit hole besides Bradley Beal, and that's the obvious one. I think if the Grizzlies get even better, and they have the flexibility, that's part of why I put them at number 1 also in the rankings, is they can put some salaries together and make a trade. They have a ton of young players. They have guys like Melton on big contracts that they can put together for deals. And if they were able to consolidate some of what they have and get another star level player, and you're talking about Ja plus a Beal type, plus a Jaren Jackson type, or plus Jaren Jackson himself, that's a really, really mean team. I just don't know how realistic it is. I don't even know if that's something they're trying to do, if they just want to continue to grow normally. But that would probably be my bonus there, my honorable mention question. But that's it. I've just been thinking a lot about the West, guys. Like, obviously, the Warriors are now even at 1-1 in the finals. I think the West is just going to get a lot better next year. I think it's going to be, after 2 bizarre seasons where it's been, messed up with injuries, I think we're finally going to get the bloodbath Western Conference that we kind of thought was there. It's just not been fully there. And the Suns are going to be right in the middle of it. So not a very Suns-heavy show today, but I think those lessons from the Jazz thing are really important. And I think that they're going to have to be aggressive when you just zoom out and not only think about the Suns' questions that they need to answer for themselves, but needing to stay competitive in what will be a better conference around them. It's really important stuff. And again, I think the biggest thing to take away from this entire episode is that complacency point. It's just crazy to look back at what the Jazz did, especially the past 3 seasons, and the fact that they just kept losing these disappointing, horrible playoff losses that left their fans just like jaw dropped, and just rolled into the next season with the same roster. I think Suns fans would be really disappointed if the majority of this team was just the same exact thing heading into next year. I don't think James Jones will approach it that way. He's always been ready to make the move that we're not expecting. I think that will happen again. I don't know how big that move will be, but I think he will change things up, and I think he has to. That'll close us out for the day, guys. Check back here tomorrow. We are not going anywhere every single day throughout the offseason here on YouTube, on every podcast platform. A big thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen on this Monday, but really every day as well. Now go make Locked On NBA Big Board your second listen to get ready for the NBA draft.